Ladies and gentlemen, welcome at today's early evening panel, which its name, or panel discussion, sorry, its name is Challenges for V4 countries within European Union. And let me first introduce the panelists. Next to me is Adam Černý, who is here on behalf of Luboš Palata, who got sick on Friday, so thanks Adam that you were being able to make it even in such a beautiful Sunday. And Adam is one of the best known and famous Czech journalists. He has been a long life specialist for EU and European matters. And he is also a president of Czech Syndicate of Journalists. Next to Adam is Tomáš Puchli, who is an analyst of Friedrich August Hayek Foundation from Slovakia. Welcome.
Thank you.
Maria Staškiewicz used to work for Aspen Institute, Prague and Central Europe. Now she is chairman of a fintech association in Czech Republic. So she is not a specialist on V4, but she is from Poland, even though she lives here, so she can have interesting perspective. And let me introduce Peter Balázs, director of Center of European Neighboring Studies from Hungary. Welcome, Peter. Okay, so first few words. What are we going to from me, like a moderator? So, what kind of sense we should also speak about? What kind of sense does it have? This what's the sense of the existence of the group of Visegrad countries? So is it only some common historical experience, starting with being parts of Austrian-Hungarian monarchy, and with a heritage of communism and in some parts like Soviet occupation? Also, perhaps, according to some, it makes sense to have some groups of countries in which Germany is not a part of, because Germany doesn't have to be in everything. Maybe it makes sense to have something which Austria is not a part of, because it has been the center of the region for many centuries, etc. But there is a question into what extent these countries should be integrated institutionally. How much sense it has economically also? What is the level of economic cooperation in the region? As far as Eurozone, for instance, Slovakia is the only country in V4 which is a member of the Eurozone, and it's also the only country which openly declares that it wants to stay in the very core of EU, as close as possible to Germany and France. This is an official position of Slovakia. All of these countries suffered from quite a bad reputation in these so-called countries. We don't know into what extent it is justified. We will definitely discuss it. But these countries are considered troublemakers because they don't want to accept mandatory quotas. That's more complicated in Slovakia for distributing migrants and refugees. And so this is another point. And some of these countries, especially Poland and Hungary, recently had troubles, mainly Poland, with the European Union as far as the liberal democracy values or European values or independence of justice system and free press. and also Poland and Hungary somehow consider themselves leaders. Even Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán even proclaimed that he wants to establish that he is not for liberal democracy, that he kind of enjoys the term illiberal democracy, even though it's perhaps not because we know, everyone knows this term from Farid Zakaria, so this is exactly not what he meant. But anyway, it's and somehow Poland and Hungary proclaim themselves to be conservative countries, which will be, into an extent, culturally saviors of this of European whatever traditions and Christianity, etc. So for such a long introduction, but I just wanted to kick off some topics on which we could speak about. So perhaps I could start with Peter Balázs.
Okay, thank you for this opportunity. Let me add to my introduction that this center is operating at the Central European University in Budapest, so you can better locate my message. What kind of an operator, what kind of an actor is Visegrad? It's a very good question. For me, Visegrad is a small dragon with 4 heads. It has the weight of a big member state like France, but has 4 heads speaking separately. I can well remember the time I was very close to politics, back in 1991, when on an icy, cold day, in the ruins of the Visegrad Castle, to the north from Budapest, 3 wonderful persons signed the Visegrad Declaration. Václav Havel, Lech Wałęsa, and Arpad Götz. And also the Biden Prime Minister of Hungary, József Antal, was present. It was a wonderful moment to see that by then there were 3 countries coming together and launching something special. Today, Visegrad is a club in a bigger club. Visegrad is a club of 4 in the big club of EU 28 today, and also in NATO. But there is a reverse situation, a very interesting situation, because the cohesion of the bigger club, EU, is much stronger than the cohesion of that smaller unit. Visegrad has no statute, no institutions practically, no budget, nothing at all, has a 1-page declaration. And of course we have the wonderful Visegrad Fund, which helps research and some conferences like this one. But we have a rotating presidency, and then it depends to a very large extent on the willingness of the governments. And we've got the experience that when there are at least 2 governments going in one direction, they may pull with them the 2 others, especially if Poland is one of the 2. So the magic formula of Visegrad is, where does Poland plus at least 1 country go? Then it determines more or less the possibilities of Visegrad. For the time being, Poland and Hungary are very close to each other, and they are going in a direction which brings them rather away from the mainstream EU. These are the 2 countries challenging Article 7 for the time being, challenging the values, trying to play a kind of a veto player in the EU. Then we could discuss, if you put further questions, whether it's a good strategy or not, whether it has these countries or not. I think the 2 other countries, the Czech Republic is difficult to define for the time being because of the internal situation. But when Mr. Fico from Slovakia was asked some months ago what would be his choice in case he had to make a choice, Visegrad or the Eurozone. He said, of course, the Eurozone. So Slovakia is in the first class of our train, as you have mentioned, in the Eurozone. The others are not. And we have a lot of common interests. We have several layers of historical background. I think it is very important that these were the nations, the four nations, which stood up against the Soviet rule in 1956 and 68. This is a very important event. So this is much more important than the first free trade agreement in Central Europe by 1335, which gave the idea and the name to Visegrad Cooperation. The Polish, Czech and Hungarian king wanted to divert trade from the Vienna route and concluded this early agreement. We are one market, we have a lot of common interests within the EU, and new challenges. I think migration is just a topic, we can discuss it if there is any question about that, but this is not the main issue. The main issue is now the new budget. The new EU budget, the main issue is the Eurozone, the future of the Eurozone, which will be discussed tomorrow. The main issues are the energy networks and energy dependence. Main issue is the transport connections between and among these countries and with the rest of Europe, and we could add a few more. I will stop here.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Maria.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think it's the first panel while sitting on it. To sit on it, it's enough to be a Polish person, but given my previous assignments at the Association for International Affairs, the Institut, and now the Czech Republic Association, I'll try to give you maybe a little bit different angle and perspective, and also not living in Poland actually for the last 14 years already, I probably have a different perspective on that as well, and I cannot see anyone from the Polish embassy, which gives me quite a broad freedom to say whatever I want for information to be sent back to Poland. Well, as far as I understand, the first question is about the nature of the group, and as was rightly noticed by Peter, the group itself does not have, unlike many of other, like the Nordic Council or the Baltic grouping, they don't have any secretariat, which in fact makes it, I would say, a project-based loose grouping of 4 countries. Which is filled in with content depending, of course, on the governments. That's why we don't have, or the common agenda changes dependently on the governments. First of all, it was, the first project was the preparation for the memberships in the EU and NATO. Then it might have been understood as a voting bloc within the EU, as a preparation for negotiations on various issues within the EU. If we look at the before from a more ideological angle, we can see it as a counterbalance, a geopolitical counterbalance to the German, Franco-German engine. I've participated in many debates like this where before was declared dead, then it was declared as being reborn. So for me, before is let's say a bubble that can be filled in with content that we want it to be currently. I would say that especially when you look at Hungary and Poland and the points that those 2 countries put in their programs for the before presidencies, I would say that they try to use the before as another vehicle to put forward a modernization narrative. If you've seen the programs of the presidencies, the Polish one, the current Hungarian ones, they stress modernization. They stress single market, especially in terms of digital issues. They want the region to become center of innovation. They want to attract new investments to the region. So when we look at the V4 right now, I would say that this is the focus goes back or goes more goes away from political issues and goes back, comes closer to economic ones. And maybe in a provocative way, I would say that some of the governments, especially in Poland and Hungary, they seem to be closer to the Chinese way when they want to give economic security, investments. They want to put forward the innovation ideology, but they feel less secure about the rule of law and democracy meddling with their plans of modernizing the region. I think that's enough for me for now.
So, Tomáš.
Good evening. Well, I will start with maybe a narrative about the importance of V4 as a bloc. Well, first of all, I think it's very loosely associated group of countries, and well, it makes sense actually, but it's based on, of course, specific agendas. Like V4 can come together in situations like opposing some initiatives from European Union, especially West countries, and well, I can let's say it's a regulation and maybe migration question. That's two very important policies that prime ministers and public of these countries rejected very strongly. We as V4 have, of course, specific historic background, as was said, and in context of migration crisis, we do not have any recent experience with mass migration or cultural diversity, not in such extent as let's say France or Germany. So maybe it's quite natural that voters of these countries were strongly against such new trends, especially if they come in such strong waves. And second is, of course, economic interest, because if we look at the tendencies in regulations, especially in the area of business regulations, France and Germany actually tend to regulate more and more strictly, which of course poses great regulatory costs on the small and medium enterprises, especially in this region. So it's quite natural that such countries tend to cooperate from time to time. But if we look at the core of the issue, of course it's like economics. And let's talk about position of Slovakia. Of course, we are part of the V4, but our main economic interest lies in Germany. We are strongly dependent on exports to Germany. A large portion of our economy actually is dependent on demand in Germany and other Western countries, but especially Germany. So that's the one, maybe one of the most important points why the Slovakia is so Euro optimistic. But there are actually in position of Slovakia there are two main reasons. The first is economic, of course, and second one is historical. After a very complicated politically and economically 90s, after rule of Prime Minister Vladimir Mečiar, there was a large social and political change. And Slovak society decided that our only viable direction is to be European values and to lean to the West. And to this day, we can see this trend in society. Actually, there was a poll by one of the major polling agencies in Slovakia just about 1 week ago, and it showed again that like 75% of Slovaks are positive about membership in the European Union. And it may be an anomaly in this region, but historically given and economically, of course, it's very logical. Of course, nationalists and Eurosceptics are on the rise also in Slovakia, but there are fringe parties and fringe voters, and given our history, it's safe to say that we will be pro-European in the coming years. And of course, we are part of the Eurozone, and I think I can say after such years that it was a very successful project. Of course, we need many more years before we can evaluate whether it was something that added to Slovak economy or was like neutral. We will see, but it's mainly about politics. Euro gives us, of course, a strong feeling of integration with the West. It's some kind of political assurance, and of course, given the ties with Germany, it's very logical and so on. So I will stop here.
Thank you. Adam?
Yeah. Good evening, everybody. And of course, in the line, so difficult to develop knowledge is something very surprising. But I will start with some, let's say, personal feeling. I remember when I was young and I read the fairy tales for the children. They already finished with the phrase, and the two have lived happily forever, yeah? And after the marriage. And after reading a couple of those stories, my question was, how they live happily for so long? How is this possible? And sometimes coming back to the harsh political reality, I had the impression that those V4 that have this common goal to enter the European Union and NATO and so on, they found themselves after the entry with the question, what we are doing there? What is our role? Sometimes it is easy, sometimes it is not, but I think that very striking the example of Slovakia and the comparison, let's say, with the Czech Republic, because Tomáš has well described the position of the Slovakia vis-à-vis the Eurozone after the experiences of bad Mečiar's era, and I think at that time they really felt that they could be left out, or all the French. And I think if I can compare it with the Czechs, I think they hadn't such an experience. They have already feeling to be the first in the room, and I think this is one of the explication why they have not such a strong feeling where they are, what they should do. Another comparison with Slovakia is they are in the Eurozone. If I remember well, there was no time in the new political Slovak life when strong discussion about Euro, with strong pro, strong contra, past. Never. It was an issue out of the public political debate. In Czech Republic, what we are hearing, very reluctant towards the Eurozone, and sometimes even very lukewarm to the European project as such. I think behind this formative experience from the 90s. It's the first point. Second point is about the formation of the V4. I think there is some very important asymmetry. Yeah, there is some very important asymmetry. If you look at the Poland, with I don't know, for 40 million of inhabitants, and the rest of the asymmetry is very clear. It's very difficult to make good political balance. And I think this is one of the reasons why there is no structural, institutional structure for the V4, because all four they felt that they have something together, but they don't know intention to put it in let's say strong political level with all the necessary background. So I feel in this some contradiction. Another story is the story which is linked to the migration. Because if you look especially at two from the V4 and at the history, we see in the Czech case and in the Polish case that in the past centuries there was mixed societies in Poland, even if they do not exist, and in the Czech Republic also. It's only after the split of the Czechoslovak Federation that the Czech found themselves and suddenly in the ethnically homogeneous society. And majority of the Czech feel that it's absolute in nature, that it belongs to their history, which is not true. Very important. So, coming back to relation to the whole political project, I think really one thing is missing in Czech Republic: strong voice in favor of European project. Because if there is somebody who is strongly speaking in favor of this, let's say Prime Minister Fico in the Slovak case, we see that there is a political consensus about this, and here there is even those politicians like, let's say, Mr. Previous Prime Minister Sobotka, who is, let's say, lukewarm Euro-optimistic. He never had the courage to put it very clear on the table. That is one of the reasons why I found out that there is different feeling in Europarlament towards the European project. So this is just a few. Coming back to the remark of the small dragon with 4 heads. This is a good question, because I don't think that this is such a small dragon. Because if I come together, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, and Slovakia together is afraid, I don't know, 60 million of inhabitants. Of course, the economic power is not just such a one, but it could be a much bigger dragon as a small one.
Okay, thank you. So I would kick off a few more topics, and I will ask the panelists to react on it for those who want, and then we would open the discussion to your questions. And so first thing is the trademark of Visegrad really becoming toxic, or has it become toxic recently from mainly due to the issue of migration and the way it was, all the publicity around it. And not only to the migration, also to these tendencies in Poland and Hungary with so-called illiberal democracy and the already open dispute between European Commission and Poland. So, on the other hand, the counter opinion obviously is that just recently, a few years ago, Poland still was a shining example of pro-European liberal country with a different government. Now the picture is completely different. So, should this institution, which not, as Maria rightly pointed out, not very much institutionalized, should it diminish itself into something less important, or dissolve itself just because it is becoming toxic for many elites in the so-called or traditional core countries of the EU? So that's the first question. There is also an interesting question of speedy economic growth, which all these countries share, that they grow economically more than traditional countries in Western Europe, but somehow they don't forget to proclaim it and say, like, look, we are less regulated, as you say, we grow, we are catching up, we are more dynamic, and so we are a good example. We are providing Europe with more economic growth, and we make it stronger, so don't blame us on anything. So sort of like emphasizing the economic successes, sort of to defend some different models, especially we can hear it in Hungary and Poland very typically these days. Also, Maria said that it is not institutionalized before, but it has a presidency. It should be mentioned that it has a presidency, which changes as the EU every 6 months, right? So it makes it a little bit more, but you are right that it doesn't have a political secretariat or something, but there is an opinion also, you said you can have a lot of these groupings or voluntary groupings within the EU, it just makes it more colorful, competitive, healthy. You have Benelux, you have Baltic countries cooperating. And recently there have been many other initiatives, for instance, also in the region, the so-called Austerlitz group, which met once basically with French President in Salzburg, and it is, but it was some kind of a political signal, obviously, because it's only Czech Republic, Slovakia, Austria, and France. So it's there is no space for these countries which claim themselves to be conservative saviors of European beliefs, if I put it this way. So I just kick off these few topics, so I would ask once again Peter to...
Well, let me start with your question whether Visegrad is toxic or is it good. I would make a parallel. 20 or 25 years ago, it was wonderful to be a Hungarian. Hungarians were those who opened the borders for the GDR refugees. Hungarians, together with the Poles, were those who started the opening and many other things. So it was wonderful. Today, I try to avoid to confess my nationality in international companies, because then they start pointing to me that your prime minister, your country, and I say, it's not my prime minister, I was in the previous government and not in this government, and so on. So it depends on what we are doing, and it is valid for Visegrad. Visegrad could be a wonderful trademark. Visegrad is well known. We have introduced this trademark in the EU, but the content is different. Migration is a very important issue in Germany, in Italy, in Sweden, in Denmark. But I could ask my colleagues from the other three Visegrad countries, how many migrants have you ever seen in your life? In Hungary, we have seen 400,000. Have you seen 400,000? Certainly not. Maybe a very few. But even in Hungary, only those Hungarians who live near to the Serbian border, the city of Szeged, then the route, the straight way to Budapest, and from Budapest to Vienna. Not outside. Outside those regions, people have never seen migrants. Because migrants have never gone to the eastern plains of Hungary and to some mountains. So this was a rapid transit. Migrants were kind people as long as we did not stop them. When they were stopped, they became angry because they wanted to go on. Nobody wanted to stay in Hungary. This is an impossible language and low salaries. So why on earth should they stay once they left their remote homes in Afghanistan, and Syria, and many other countries? When they took all that risk, risking sometimes their lives, they want to optimize their future life and getting as much as possible to rich countries and not to medium level revenue countries. There was in Hungary, there was also a funny political party, the two-tailed dog party. And they proposed that instead of the fence, what Orban erected on a small piece of the border, we should just put the salaries. And then when people calculate the salary, they will run away, and they would never have the idea to stay in Hungary. It's very much so. With the EU, there was a very difficult situation by September 2015. And they took a wrong decision in the Council of Ministers of Interior, those quotas. I had the privilege to work within the Commission and also in the Council. They made a mistake. And the mistake was the following. Before coming down to drafting texts or finding technical solutions, you need a political agreement of the member states. And there was no political agreement. So they should have put the question to everybody that, do we agree that Germany is overloaded by migrants? Yes, everybody says yes. Okay. Do we agree that we should do something for Germany on behalf of the other countries in any form? Yeah, everybody's nodding. Do we agree that the form of that sharing of the burden should be a relocation of migrants? No. Okay, then let's discuss further. Because there were some countries which could not imagine that they take over refugees. Let's come to a political agreement in what form can we help Germany to ease the burden. And when we are at that point, then we can say that, Joe, now you can go out, make an Excel table, country per migrant. And then we accept it, but not before. So the best thing would be, in my perception, to revoke this whole relocation issue, not to offer a very easy target for populist governments to resist. Because they are resisting for nothing. The share, the quote of Hungary would be 1,300 refugees, recognized refugees with a real refugee status. And Hungary is resisting. In the meantime, an official from the foreign ministry has recognized that we have already more than 1,300 recognized refugees in the country. So what are we speaking about? This is a non-issue in the political sphere, not about real problems. However, we are challenging with many other things, with the judiciary, with the freedom of media, and with other issues, EU values. And it is easy to say that, yes, they are punishing us because we are not taking the refugees in our countries. The topic is much more serious than that. And then I would come to that issue, what's wrong with Poland and Hungary? That we are setting a new model of non-compliant member state with EU values. We are resisting. And Orban has worked out a three-step reaction, and as I can see, his Polish colleagues are following exactly the same way. First answer to any EU critics that you are wrong, we haven't done it. No, it's a misunderstanding. A complete refusal. Second step, maybe we did it, but others are doing it as well, which is a complete twist. It is well known from the defense of criminals that first refusing, then recognizing, but looking for excuses. Third step, you are not competent to put us this question. How can you ask us? We are a sovereign state. The EU Commission is extending its powers. You shouldn't ask them. You shouldn't ask us. So these are three steps. Always there is a logical twist in the argumentation, but it's a very bad example for other countries.
Yes, I'll take it from where you stopped. There is already an expression for the copy-pasting of the Hungarian policies in Polish. I don't know if it works in Hungarian as well. My countrymen, my country people call it the Budapest Warsaw Express train.
Yeah.
So whatever policy is being preferred in Hungary, it's then right away exported with the express train to Warsaw. Yes. The main question here is whether the Visegrad Group is toxic currently. I mean, yes and no. On the very on the surface level, toxicity comes from the Polish and Hungarian government, especially from their newly developed political concept of illiberal democracy. But as I understood, Orban already changed it, and he wants to create a modern Christian democracy that would find a place in the 21st century, probably based on modern technologies. I don't know what's his exact understanding of that. And in Poland, we have the idea, Kaczynski introduced the idea of impossibilism, which he understands in the following way. The main idea goes that democratically elected government, which is legally put in voters in a position to express the will of the society, actually cannot cannot act on this society will, because it is constrained by check and balances of constitutions, for example. So I mean, it's a shortcut of the idea of the impossibilism as introduced by Kaczynski some 10 years ago. So hence, because of this idea that almost everything that has been introduced since the transformation in the early 90s was actually a bad idea, to put it very briefly and shortly. He now goes counter democratic institutions exactly for the purpose of reforming the country, because the society wants to get rid of a system that basically put many people in Poland, not only in Poland, on the verge of poverty, that brought foreign capital to Poland, that is stifling Poland from growing and becoming one of the major powers in Europe. So that's why the toxicity comes within the Visegrad Group. But when you go a little bit a step further or deeper, actually, this was actually seen very well in the migration crisis. Visegrad Group, some of its members play the role of Hungary for the entire EU, saying aloud things that many governments, including French, German governments, think, but it's not so well taken over by media, especially in terms of, for example, the migration crisis. I know it's a pretty complicated issue to get a very easy solution among 28 member states. But when you look at the current debate, at the current migration package, as I understand it, if I'm not right, correct me. But the mandatory distribution of asylum seekers, migrants, is not part of the Dublin reform anymore. So it's actually what the Visegrad governments were saying before, were pointing in a very bad way, in a not very skilled way, actually comes back to the package 2 years after the debate was open. So I think that the unfounded ripple is also a good way to describe the group, because the group members point and add to a different point to a European debate. They do it in a not very skilled way. They are not using all the diplomatic channels and ways they could do to convince their partners to win them to their side. But I wouldn't say that their argument is not valid as part of the discussion. Also, as could be seen in the migration crisis debate. When it comes to the economic aspect, given the Brexit, and partially mentioning what you've said, Tomasz, that after Brexit, after the UK leaves the club, the more economically liberally oriented countries may fill in the void that will be there in the EU. As the tendency, the support for competition, for less regulation is there. So I think it's not a bad thing that before that there is a bloc, quite a strong bloc within the EU that will put forward the agenda. So that's for me for now.
Before before I give the floor to Tomáš, I would just touch also a few economic things, more like you mentioned less regulation, but it depends on what perhaps in the labor market above all. These countries are less regulated somehow, but on the other hand, if you look at Czech Republic, it's almost impossible to construct a new building, especially in Prague. Like so, this is you wait 7 years before you get all the permissions. So in this respect, for instance, Czech Republic is absolutely overregulated, even more than countries in the core. But so that's just one thing. But Tomáš, could you also? I forgot to mention there is one thing these countries also have in common. Could you a little bit mention it also? From this famous Piketty's blog, it was revealed, which made it very popular topic, this French economist, that outflow of dividends from all these 4 countries is much bigger than inflow of these so-called EU subsidies, even though these two are not comparable to an extent, but he concludes that in a way we became a bit like colonies for Western European countries.
Thank you. Well, first to the V4 question, and then yes, I will get to the beginning. And in my point of view, of course, V4 is a very toxic brand, and the main reason for that, I think, is that our governments tend to see EU as a money bag. We want in ideal position close our borders to everything and let through only EU funds, and that will be ideal state. And governments of the V4 bloc are well behaving in that manner. And to the frustration, of course, of the Western countries, we tend to forget that the European Union is also about some values, and not only about funds and about investment stability and jobs and economic growth. And it's part of the reasons why Slovakia joined, but I think the other countries in V4 are not so strong on this position. Of course, in Slovakia, our governments also tend to, just want to get as much money as possible, and if some unpleasant topics arise, of course, they want to kill the bill. And of course, it's a matter of the migration. True is that in Slovakia we have like dozen migrants we accepted. So it's very interesting that the general public is very concerned about migration, though we have never seen one in real life in any of our cities. It's not like in Budapest, of course. Part of the reason is that in 2016 there were general elections in Slovakia, and until then we had only one ruling party. It was Social Democracy Smer, and they of course lost many voters during the 4 years, and this was a very easy target to gain some new voters. So they started to, of course, very adamant in rejecting the quotas, of course, and Slovaks are very homogeneous society, and we have no experience, no fresh experience at least with migration and cultural diversity. So it was only natural that the voters supported such parties that rejected migration quotas. And strangely enough, it was not only case of the Social Democratic Party, but also our strongest opposition party, Liberal Party. They also strongly rejected the idea. So it's a kind of consensus in Slovakia that we do not want to accept quotas. And it's also part of the reason why we are seen as troublemakers. We rejected the quotas, but we may not be seen as the constructive partners in discussion in these European matters, because we just tend to criticize, but we are not constructive in finding a solution. And of course, it's very important to keep in mind that European Union is definitely not a project that is finished. There is a lot of work ahead of us. One of these topics, of course, is security of the borders, and of course handling of migration. We definitely need policies about that. Status quo is not sustainable in the long run. Of course, there are regulatory issues, and in that manner, it's also interesting enough that I would say that V4 countries are generally more liberal-oriented in regulation, but we see strange phenomena in policy making. Of course, our politicians in Slovakia is very common. They regularly attack Brussels because they are dictated from Brussels and bad regulations and so on. But in the discussion, I wouldn't say they forget. They deliberately not tell this. But if we want a single market, we need a single regulations, because of course it will be very difficult for one small firm to operate in 28 sets of regulation. But this is the reason why we have common regulations across all 28 countries. It's something that actually creates the single market. It's not just about open borders. But the thing is that there is in Brussels, in the European institutions, there is a very high culture in making regulations. It's very high quality. They do regulatory impact assessment, which is definitely not something that is common in V4 countries. And very strange outcome is a phenomenon called gold plating. When it comes to regulations from European Union, our governments tend to add more restrictions on top of what European Union demands as the common regulations. But when people find out, then businessmen, government just tells, no, it's not us, it's Brussels. We have nothing to do with that. And that's very toxic practice, and it's very difficult to explain to the people, because there are technical issues that are added by policymakers, and in such manners that we cannot see them in advance. It just pops out when the regulations come to effect. And of course, what is not finished is institutional structure of the European Union, especially Eurozone. I would say that status quo is stable for the good weather, but as a crisis showed us, it's not so much sustainable in the crisis. And definitely we need to make some measures in strengthening the structure of institutions in the European Union, especially in the Eurozone. We need more cooperation between countries, of course, because we are in the half step. It's a very difficult position. We either take a step back or step forward, but it's not sustainable like it is. Of course, Euro is much a political project, and it comes with the costs, but as Greece showed us, it's not so easily done to withdraw from the Union. We just need to go forward, because it's not possible, or it's not to simply abandon the euro as it is. It will be very costly. So there need to be reform in the European institutions, and as a V4, we shall not only criticize but also to be constructive and come with some proposals. And to the Piketty question, well, it's a quite complicated question. It's very true that Western companies are investing heavily in our countries, and of course they are withdrawing a lot of dividends. But on the other hand, our economies are of course advancing, but it was a stage in the late 90s and early 2000s that we needed these investments, because after 40 years of communism, our economy simply have enough capital. So we simply needed foreign capital to start investments, to start growth, to start new jobs, and so on. And of course, it's only natural that these companies are withdrawing dividends. But by now, we are advancing to another phase where we have sufficient capital in our countries. Our own big firms are growing, more and more of them. We have examples of firms that grew on international level. Let's say I don't know, mention them, not to make advertisement here. So I think it's only natural, and I don't see any problem with that.
I can just continue with the argument that the problem with toxicity of V4 is linked to the issue of migration, because this is the divisive topics and defensive topics. So the V4 there is no positive argumentation, positive example. So this until this will be not solved, the toxicity will be there. That's for sure. But to add some remarks to this economic topics, I think that we can see some differences if we look at that kind of V4, because if we took, for example, Poland, there were not such a huge privatization of those, let's say, strategic sectors in the energetic sector, and the other sector. If we compare it, let's say, with the banking sector, if we compare it with the Czech Republic, but only for big four banks belong to the foreign investor, due to the reason that Tomáš was already mentioned. We see clearly the differentiation. Of course, with the economic development, we see now growing big domestic enterprises that can invest, and maybe we will see how it will be solved. Because I think that the solution that was tried in let's say, in Hungary with the sectorial tax, and so I don't think that this is sustainable. This is very important. And maybe one more remark to the cohesion of V4 and the asymmetry that I mentioned before. I think that we should not forget one important point, that Poland has not only the option of Visegrad. From time to time, Poland is playing with Nordic Council, Baltic countries, and so, which is not the case of the let's say, Czech Republic or Slovakia. They have no other viable options. That's my point.
Okay, thank you. So I saw Blond.
Yeah. I'm slightly puzzled because the talk about Hungary and Poland is if they're somehow on the margins in a completely unrecognisable state, and the rest of Europe is appalled. But if you look at the polling in Europe, for instance, YouGov polled in YouGov polled in April 2017. The top two concerns of the overwhelming majority, I think all European countries with the exception of Italy, was terrorism and migration. They were clearly linked in the public's mind. Italy was terrorism and unemployment. Probably a comment on the Italian situation. And it's very clear that populism is popular. And it's popular because it's answering and recognising problems that elite narratives or liberal narratives can't recognise. So for the liberal mindset, migration can only be a good. And there's endless economic models claiming that and arguing that. But what this excludes is the social cost of migration. this excludes all the externalities that are manifest in countries like France, where levels of social trust between Muslim communities and host French countries citizens are at catastrophically low levels. And so it might be the case, rather, that what Orban and Poland are speaking of, what Brexit indicated, is actually this ruling liberal narrative is deeply questionable. It's questionable from the future of Europe. It's questionable because the migrants that are coming in are predominantly viewed, though it's not necessarily empirically true, as Muslim, and people fear Islamification. And looking at certain parts of Western Europe, that's not a false fear. And so to create the conditions to recognise that danger is actually far from being marginal, it's central. And moreover, I have some sympathy with the Poles and the Hungarians, since they're all meant to bear the cost of Merkel's unilateral decision to open the borders, which he didn't happen to consult other Europeans on. So what I think is missing from this narrative is the fact that this narrative is questioned now in almost every major European country, this legacy of extreme economic liberalisation and extreme social liberalisation. And in the extreme economic liberalisation, which I know I can see for Eastern European countries, the development gain is such that, and I take Thomas's point, I think he's right, that actually the level of growth it's got the countries to probably couldn't have happened in any other way. But I also recognise what the Poles are saying, that we don't want an oligarchical outcome, which is what you certainly have in the UK, and it's what you certainly have in America. So one might actually compliment the Poles for actually saying, actually at this point, we want better distributional outcomes than modern forms of capitalism have given us. Well, I think that's quite acute, actually. And given that the OECD has now said that the levels of inequality intra-nations is higher than levels of inequality between nations, I think it probably is acute. And insofar as we view social liberalism as, synonymous with migration is a good thing, well, it demonstrably isn't, because we don't have very strong success stories of Islamic integration into our host nations. It works well if you're upper middle class, but the nature of human beings is not everybody is upper middle class with that value set. So responding to popular concern isn't always fascist, though sometimes it is, I take that, isn't always extreme, and actually it might head off those extremes and that level of fascism. So I think we need to take things at the grand scale, because my country, which is probably the most successful multicultural nation in Europe, I would argue, close to being the most successful multicultural.
Which is your country?
Sorry?
Which is your country?
Britain, sorry, the United Kingdom.
Thank you.
No, thank you, Peter. I thought it was kind of obvious from my accent.
I guess. It could be an educated Irishman.
No. True. I am from Liverpool, so that's probably accurate. So if you look, if we can vote Brexit out of essentially a working class fear of Islamification, which is what I would argue the Brexit vote was, because it took place shortly after all the horrendous terrorist attacks, took place after Merkel's open doors, took place after the migrant flows. And if you look at all the various studies of Brexit, and I have, they all privilege cultural identity above economic self-interest. All of the studies show that. And this is Britain, for goodness sake, that has been a multinational country since probably, well, since Athelstane in about 1247. So these are not necessarily minor concerns that they can push out one of the largest European nations. And until we can construct a recognition that something has gone wrong economically, but something has also gone wrong culturally in terms of the ruling values within Europe, I'm afraid something like the Hungarian-Polish model is likely to become more and more popular. And I wrote a book 10 years ago where I argued that we're in post-liberal times and post-liberal politics. And it's quite interesting to see Orban use this phrase and then try to link it with Christian democracy. And then if you read Utkin or Rupke's work, they're all about trying to limit the extremes of liberalism. That's what ordo-liberalism originally was. So these are not foreign innovations to the manner that perhaps the panel tried to suggest they were. I completely agree that the attempt to reduce them to narrow nationalism is a mistake for both countries, but I think done well and done properly, I don't see why this shouldn't command a great degree of support across the whole of Europe. And so I think rather than having a superior than thou, and no doubt you are superior than many of those you criticise, but I don't think the problems are. I think the problems, the people you criticise are actually ahead of the curve. And perhaps it's the narrative you speak that is behind. That's probably enough.
Thank you very much. Was there Peter?
Let me start with a concrete memory. In late summer 2015, when tens of thousands of migrants arrived every day to Hungary, and not everybody found a train or a bus. Thousands marched on the highway from Budapest to Vienna. And people were standing by and just regarding. And a TV reporter put questions to those standing by, average Hungarian countryside people. What's your feeling? And one couple said, I hate them. They are Muslims. They should go away. They should go home. Okay, but what about that mother with that small child? Okay, that mother could stay. Could you give her a drink or? Yes, of course. What about that old man? Yeah, he too. And what about that servant? And when they put the questions one by one, people recognized human beings and wanted to help. And there were people who took off their shoes and offered them to the migrants because they had used shoes of any kind and they were marching. Okay, there are at least 4 different categories among the EU member states. A few countries are overloaded, like Germany and Sweden and a few others. There were other countries with a heavy burden of transit, but only transit, not staying there, coming and going. There are countries of the first entry. Today, Italy is number 1. To some extent, Spain, Portugal, Greece used to be. And there are countries which are absolutely outside the whole thing. And we try to do some common action, bringing together those 4 very different categories. You can imagine this is very usual practice in EU Council. Then they let the most active to start first, and then they are looking for support and coalition. So this is a very difficult thing. There are tensions around migration, and if there are tensions, we have to localize the conflicts. There are 2 basic conflicts which should be eased. One is that in that particular case, migrants try to to single out their final destination. When in 1956 there was the Hungarian Revolution, Hungarian refugees went a few kilometers to Austria and had to stay in Dreiskirchen in a camp. They got shelter and food, and then came an Australian delegate saying that I have a quota for 2,000 people. Who would like to come to Australia? Okay. Then came La Légion étrangère from France. Who would like to be a brave soldier for France, dying for France? Okay. Well, then came a Danish agent saying that they had exactly 2,000 people quota, and so on. So not the migrants selected first, but they got offers. This time we have people who have a destination in their head, and this is conflicting with our offers or willingness. In addition, under the pressure of Germany and the EU Commission, they introduced this quota system, which is another source of conflict. And if you add to that the general fear from the unknown, from globalization, underinformed or uninformed, undereducated people in the Hungarian countryside are very open for any kind of propaganda.
If I may say a word, I'm pretty highly educated. No doubt others are more so. But I think that the working class fears are sometimes more acute than middle class repudiation of them. And the sense, you know, there's a sense in which assimilating or trying to assimilate and then failing to assimilate people who have profoundly different value and cultural systems in Europe is not going to work. And one can sense that should, and there might be peasants, but they might be right about that. And I'm probably several generations away from being a peasant stock, but I think they're probably right about that. So I think that you can have intuitions and you can have folk wisdom that actually isn't far removed from people like Ivan Krasnut's The Future of Europe. You know, there is a sense that the type of migrant flows we're facing may well overwhelm Europe and end Europe. And that isn't just part of a demonology. I think it has some intellectual coherence to it. I don't think it's a priori false.
Well, I think that what a populist is doing is there is a wound, and instead of healing that wound, like a fear, Orban is putting some salt on that wound in order to increase the pain of people and threatening people. He won the elections on the 8th of April with a huge big threat that Hungary is going to be invaded, except if you vote for me because I will protect you.
I voted Remain in Britain. I'm a pro-European British Conservative, which is a rare and splendid thing. And the Leave campaign ran a whole series of demonstrable lies about the EU. But I understand why people voted to leave. And I think if we're going to tackle that, we can't discount their takes really. And I think they're more valid than perhaps you're allowing. I mean, I think importing hostile minorities is not a good future for Europe, for instance.
Okay, can I give you last short answer? I don't want to monopolize that topic.
It's a nice conversation.
One of the lies of Mr. Orban was that I protect you with a fence I have erected on the southern border of Hungary. You know the length of this fence on the Hungarian-Serbian border is 176 kilometers. This is 8% of the total length of the borders. 8%, 92% are unprotected. And he could sell that short piece of fence as an overall protection for the country, instead of saying that we have as a government three very different tasks. One is saving lives. When people are frozen in winter time, giving them food and shelter and medical care. This is one thing. Not asking who you are, but helping them. This is first. Second, asking them, who are you? Taking a very clear identity of each and every person who enters our territory and then handling them according to their wishes. And third, either returning or integrating depending on the capacities and willingness of the population. This would be a responsible government answer and not refusing everybody and making obstruction against any attempt of the EU, because when now the Dublin reform emerged in the EU, the Hungarian position was that why don't we wait until the next European Parliament with that issue? So,
but I suppose
Okay, so
it's a very interesting discussion.
It is. Maybe we can come back to it. We still have some time. So, is anyone on the panel who wants to add something to it? Or, so, okay, so we can others. Ross.
Thanks, Al. I'd like to thank IPPS for organizing this important colloquium today, and thank you for coming. There's one word that we haven't heard this afternoon, and the word is Ukraine. I know it strikes fear in a lot of people to think about it, but in fact there is a war going on, a Russian invasion and occupation of Crimea and large parts of the Donbass. But looking beyond that, the question is, what about the Visegrad 4? I too have been to many of these colloques where everyone seems to find it stylish to say that the V4 is dead. It has no purpose, there's no goal, but in fact this is patently wrong, in my opinion. In the next 30 years, and we're very close to 3 decades from the Velvet Revolution, in the next 30 years, an order of magnitude more money from all sources worldwide will be invested and used in Ukraine by the Ukrainians rebuilding their country to connect to places like the Visegrad 4 and Europe and America and the Western business world. People say that there's no money for business, and I beg to disagree. In the past week and a half, we have seen announcements by the International Monetary Fund and the European Union about releasing additional tranches based upon aspects of what used to be called les acquis communautaires, concerning such issues as the creation of acceptable legislation following the requirements of the West and the Venice delegation to have, an appropriate anti-corruption court set up, and new reforms concerning gas pricing policy, which would eliminate a lot of corruption and fraud as we know it now. And yet this means that in fact the billions of dollars and billions of euros which are being provided to Ukraine through a variety of techniques are actually being spent on a continuing basis. This money does not arrive on pallets in the basement of the National Bank of Ukraine and stay there. This money is getting spent. The Visegrad 4, as nations, and to borrow Peter Balash's excellent example of a friendly dragon with 4 heads, in fact has a 1,000-year history of international trade, specifically with the region we now know more or less as Ukraine. With all the changes in borders, that is relatively irrelevant these days. But the issue is, this is going to happen. It has been decided amongst the Western leading nations and important leaders who we all respect, like Madame Lagarde and others, that in fact the success of the Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity, as I said at the Polish-Czech conference some 4 years ago in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the success of the Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity is of strategic importance to the West. The money is now being spent, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on the future for the Visegrad 4 and Visegrad 4 companies and their governments in actually participating in this, because this is happening. And in the cases where individual local companies are not large enough and strong enough to do projects, they're all always larger countries like France, the United States, Canada. Canada's been very active in solar projects in Ukraine already. What are the Visegrad 4 countries and companies going to do? Because this is now. Thank you.
Who wants to comment on this?
Just a few remarks. I should remind that at the beginning, let's say in the time of Maidan in Kiev, there was a strong support from the countries as before. Yeah. Poland was very active in that field and so, but now the situation is linked with, let's say, with the relation towards the sanction on Russia. There is no cohesion in the report about this. Okay, at the end of the day, yes, because even Mr. Prime Minister Orban is voting for prolonging the sanction, but everybody knows that the attitude is different. If you look at the attitude of Mr. Orban or of Mr. Kaczynski, we see the clear differences. We see some regularities in the case of Mr. Fico. What will be the policy of the Czech government? If there will be any, I don't know. So I agree with you about the importance of the Ukrainian topics, because of course if you look at the size of the country and the geopolitical place, it's absolutely clear. But I don't have the answer if the V4 in the current status is able to make a coherent position. That's the
Maybe it's the dragon with its individual 4 heads that can create individual, localized, locally originating answers.
Maybe a few remarks on that. A few years ago, I was a journalist, and to the point of Ukraine, we tend in our media to compare Slovakia to neighboring countries. I don't remember not only time Ukraine was mentioned in the context of our neighboring countries. Of course, Slovakia experienced a lot of economic growth in the last 20 years, and it's remarkable. But in the OECD comparison, Slovakia is one of the countries with the most regional differences in the whole OECD club. And of course, we have disproportionate growth in the eastern part of the country and the western part of the country. And of course, integrating Ukraine would greatly benefit to do accelerating growth in the eastern part of the country, but somehow there are no policies toward that. So it would be great, but there are no intentions in the not only Slovak government, not only Slovak government, but before either. So
what an export opportunity.
It's opportunity we need to harvest in the future.
Just a very brief comment. Given the political divergence on the Ukraine issue, I don't think much can be done apart from reminding the EU sometimes that there is a neighbor on the eastern side, and the EU has to do something with it. But something I wanted to say pertains more to the functioning of the group itself. As was already mentioned by Peter, there is International Visegrad Fund, which has a budget of 8 million euro per year, which is a very small sum, which could be definitely doubled or tripled. And it has several programs devoted to Eastern Partnership, and that's one of the things that's definitely probably the simplest things you could do. Just use some of the money to support entrepreneurship in companies instead of just cultural projects, which is the majority the money goes to. And of course, the different thing is, in inverted commas, exporting Ukraine workers to our countries, because especially Poland boasts that they have a lot of, that they accept a lot of workers from Ukraine, but they very often are either undeclared or come to fill in the gaps of unfilled positions, and this could definitely will change.
Ukraine is extremely important, and the Visegrad 4 are the real advocates of Ukraine in the EU and in NATO. We are very, very close to this country. 3 of the Visegrad countries understand the language, except the Hungarians, but there is a small Hungarian minority in Slovakia. So there are very strong relations. We should have to re-establish the sovereignty and integrity of Ukraine. It's a very tricky issue for international diplomacy because we have to handle somehow the Crimea issue. Nobody would like to cry for Crimea in NATO. It is in Russian hands, but it's extremely difficult to accept it. What would be the counterpart? Russians have a big appetite, so if you show your little finger saying that, okay, you can keep the Crimea if you stop war and retire from Eastern Ukraine, yeah, then they say, okay, and plus, and then they ask 3 more things immediately. So there should be a very patient international solution, first stopping war and then handling those interrelated issues. And Ukraine itself, if you look to any statistics or the outcome of votes, Ukraine is consisting of 2 parts. The western part is more attached to Europe and the eastern part to Russia, for natural reasons. About 40% of people are Russian speakers, Ukrainian citizens. I had colleagues, diplomats, who were good Ukrainians but spoke Russian. And one doesn't exclude the other. So this is a very, very interesting country. For Russia, it has one very special importance, because Putin would like to re-establish the Soviet Union in one way or another under the Eurasian title. If Ukraine is there, the European dimension is there. Without Ukraine, there is no European dimension. So they need Ukraine in one way or another, but we shouldn't leave the Ukrainian dream of being attached to Europe without any support.
Thank you, Mr. Bartosz. First.
Yes, thank you. Well, I have prepared actually a little bit different questions. As far as Tomáš Puchry is concerned, you have said that Euro is a political project. Now the question is, what exactly do you understand under that? Because usually, I explain my question. Because usually, when you say something is political, so in this country, people do not like it. It has negative connotation. Have you used it in that respect, or do you want to explain exactly what do you mean under a political project? Because to a sense, it is, but why?
Of course, what I meant was that first of all, our intentions in joining the euro were more political than economical. There was public debate before joining the euro, and it was mainly centered about integrating with the West. And then there was second topic was the benefits of joining the eurozone in improving the stability for investments and maybe some benefits for the further growth of our economy. But in larger context, what I meant by that, not every country in the eurozone, euro makes sense actually, because for countries like, let's say, Greece or Italy, euro actually makes them less flexible in time of crisis, because they cannot easily devaluate their currency. So in that context, it's political because you are chained to the common currency area, but also common currency policies like central bank, and of course decision makings on the level of the coordinating governments and government policies regarding budgets.
Well, I must disagree.
Okay, but let's have it like a V4 oriented, like so.
Well, I'm trying. It's a question for me because, for example, Czech Republic doesn't have euro. Okay, so it's a topic of V4. Why somebody's got it, somebody doesn't have it. It is a political project, but completely different than you believe. Because you come from, I can read it, from Hayek's theories, and they are completely wrong, unfortunately. Because that what you said would mean that Prague would have to have different currency than a small village in Shumava, because they have different economic conditions, and they are not strong in the same. So Prague should have different crowns, and well, you recognize that this is nothing. The same is valid for United States, okay? 50 states have a dollar, the same one, not different dollars, but only one, and they have different economic foundations and capabilities. So this plays completely no role.
Okay, I would like to react. That is not exactly what I meant. Of course, I disagree that some smaller villages in the Czech Republic should use another kind of currency than, let's say, Prague. What I meant by that is some governments value more their flexibility with manipulating the currency in times of crisis. Therefore, joining the euro is much more political commitment. It's something that happened in Slovakia. It's political commitment. Of course, from my point of view, I'm not saying that for countries that are not so economically strong or are have another conditions with their economy. Out of context of before, let's say Greece, euro can be good for them, but in other conditions they are willing to make reforms, because you either devalue your currency or make reforms to make it over crisis.
Well, it's a long discussion. I stop it here because we could argue about 2 hours.
I saw a question back in there, but I don't know if Mr. Winishke.
Well, it is not going to be a question, rather a comment. First, I would like to say that Visegrad Group was formed basically because of certain affinity of political elites of those countries, resulting from sort of common struggle against communism. That was very important. And once this sort of affinity and certain common political culture became to wane, then the cohesion of the V4 started also to wane. And today I would say that Visegrad 4 is not sort of toxic, because it is irrelevant. This is the trouble. This is the trouble. Because basically, what are the common goals of this V4? Basically, they are defensive. To defend cohesion funds, to fight against migration, and so on. There are very few things in sort of moving things forward. And migration, that requires also some comment. Concerning, for example, Poland. In Poland, we adopted 70,000 Chechens, Muslims, and there was no problem, no problem. Now we have much more than 1 million Ukrainians. Not all of them, obviously, aspire to status of refugees, but at least dozens of thousands of them will remain in Poland permanently. So the situation is different. 2 or 3 years ago, we had no problems with accepting migrants. The problem of migrants was sort of used as a political tool by our government to consolidate the government and also to fight with more liberally minded parties to win the elections. So this is the problem, I think. And when we talk about Visegrad, as I said, Visegrad also is somehow diluted, at least in Poland, in much wider concept of trimare, of grouping of countries from Estonia, even Finland, to Bulgaria, Romania, and so on. Hope of Polish government was that this grouping could be formed under Polish leadership, obviously, and this would be really a counterbalance to alleged hegemony of Germany, which obviously couldn't work. So now the whole concept basically boils down to infrastructure, and this is very good, and that's what obviously sort of is something which we in V4 have in common, to develop infrastructure between our countries, because our infrastructure so far was very much sort of east-west oriented. But that's about it. Having said that V4 is irrelevant, I would not say that V4 should be simply abandoned. I am in politics, I am in favor of sort of reverse Occam principle. Don't kill the entities without the need. So I do hope that V4 has some future, but not with the present Polish government. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it was an excellent question. If I simplify it, so is there any political or positive vision of V4? I just wanted to add also before I give it, so maybe it's irrelevant, but I just want to say, but you responded yourself at the end, like that. What's currently the positive vision of Benelux, for instance? It's okay, but do they have a political vision? So there is no reason to cancel Benelux just because we are not aware of any excellent common vision or something.
Just a few remarks. First remark that Benelux, which is for from a general point of view, natural saint. It is not natural saint. It was born with difficulties and so on. It was started at the beginning of European integration in the time of when there were only 6 founding neighbors, and obviously 3 smaller countries were obliged to work together, and they have put some preconditions, especially Belgium, Luxembourg, and so on. So there were some common work, and it was passing not without difficulties. It was not so pleasant harmony. That's very important to underline. If there should be in the discussion about positive vision of Visegrad, that should be established a positive common goal. So we are back to this important question of about what is the political project, because the European integration is the positive political project because of the consequences of the war. Today we can speak about the necessity to put the Europeans together because of the global situation, because of the big powers as China and the others. That's another story. But to find a common vision, common positive vision for the Visegrad, they should work on that. Okay, it could be Ukraine, for instance, and not to mention the elephant in the room, Russia. What about Russia and the politics of Russia, especially in the space of Visegrad? That's all the other things that should be discussed and put together.
I strongly believe in Visegrad. I was very happy when it was created, and in spite of all difficulties, Visegrad is still there. There were some attempts to enlarge Visegrad. The Austrians tried several times the Regionale Partnerschaft, adding Austria and Slovenia, but it didn't work. Romania and Bulgaria had some ambitions, and maybe some other countries. Then at a certain point, another Austrian attempt was the Slavkov cooperation, only with the Czech Republic and Slovakia. It didn't work either. So in spite of all difficulties, Visegrad is still there. And Visegrad has 2 realistic dimensions to act. One is within the V4, between and among the 4 countries, we could do a lot of things better. Maybe in better times, with different governments, we could increase the institutionalization and the financing of Visegrad. It would deserve some more structure and a bit of more money. not overdoing it, but still. This is one thing. The other one, which has already been said, a kind of a cooperation within the EU. Not only a voting machine, but representing common interests. There are a lot. We could put Visegrad on the map of trans-European transport networks, much more than today. And a lot of other things. Not beyond that. Not beyond that, because within NATO there has never been a real demand for a Visegrad cooperation. NATO is selecting the strategically important countries, Poland, Romania, and the Baltics. So this is another dimension. Visegrad has limited outreach with other partners, but these two would be realistic.
Thank you very much. Before Manuel, there was someone before, but okay, so then Mr. Davidson, okay, and then
I just wanted to. Hi, so I'm the I guess I'm the Ukrainian representative, so I just wanted to maybe add a little spice to the to the gentleman who's saying those really nice things about the Ukrainians getting the next tranche and all this. You know, in many ways, obviously everyone understands here that Ukraine is the battlefield of Europe, and this is why they bring me over here to talk about these things, but it seems that our Hungarian and our Polish friends don't always understand that they can be doing a lot of bad as well as good. In the current situation with the conflict between Ukrainians and Poles on memory law, and between the Hungarians and Ukrainians on the newly passed Ukrainian educational law, the gentleman's nodding, I see he knows. There's been a lot of pressure being put on the Ukrainians within the European Union, and as the Europeans are basically at the point of where Ukraine fatigue is tipping over into Ukraine disgust within the European Union, where if Ukrainians don't start making much more progress, you're basically going to abandon them, us. When Mr. Orban makes threats to disinvite Mr. Poroshenko from EU summits because of Hungarians' dislike of the newly passed education law, these very noble words about defense pacts and our common interests and values start to fall away.
So it was a question mainly about Hungarians, but once again you showed witness.
A few weeks ago I was in Kiev at a major conference, and there was a meeting where the lady Minister for Education of the Ukrainian government was speaking. And the Hungarian ambassador was in the room, and there was a very tense dialogue between the two people before the public. I was a bit ashamed of being Hungarian by that time, because the handling of that is a conflict situation. Ukraine, which is a multicultural country, insists on education on the Ukrainian language when the people are speaking other languages, mainly Russian. This is the problem. Mainly Russian, and then come Romanian, Polish, Gagauz, and Hungarian. Maybe Hungarian is the smallest one. According to my knowledge, 0.2% of the total population of Ukraine is Hungarian speaker. 0.2%.
You're 220,000 as far as I know.
Yeah, well, less today, unfortunately. In Subcarpathia, the number is decreasing. Plus, this is a rather special relationship. This is very different for a Russian speaker child to learn Ukrainian in parallel than a Hungarian speaking, which is a very different language. So it's a very great step for a Hungarian child to learn a good Ukrainian. Of course, at a certain point there should be a deal, but not an immediate. The conflict situation is there. There should be a talk and understanding from both sides. But what Mr. Orban applied was increasing the conflict level. which is one method in international diplomacy. You either decrease or increase the conflict level in a given situation. In this time, I would have decreased the conflict level and looking for concrete, technical, small-scale solutions, step by step. Orban said that as long as there is not a radical change, Hungary would prevent any rapprochement of Ukraine to NATO. Very bad answer. Very bad answer. Believing that we're misusing Hungary's NATO membership, putting big Ukraine under pressure, and what is worse, taking the side of Putin in that issue, which is bad strategy.
Okay, thank you. So, Manuela?
Thank you. I would like to put a question to the table because I did not hear a comment about energy, which seems to be a pretty complex issue to the countries involved in the V4. And also, in a way, you see that the geopolitics of Europe are changing so fast that one wonders what the position of the V4 might be towards Russia, especially now with the situation changing both in Italy in a serious manner and also in Germany as reaction to the US in what is now being heard about Nord Stream 2 again. I do not wish to go too much into these details, but are these not strong pressures for an idea of deepening or resisting V4? In a sense that it is quite strange to listen to the argument of infrastructure. You don't need to be in the V4 for infrastructure. You could have Austria, you could have Saxony, you could have Bavaria. In what concerns infrastructure, coming for a country like Portugal that is at the end of Europe, infrastructure problems have to be solved in Brussels and then with allies that will help vote programs through from any country of the EU that has a number of votes. And sometimes it seems that maybe one could ask this question: is the V4 not preventing individual countries that belong to it, like the Czech Republic, to seek alliances with other European countries that have similar situations, maybe more similar by size, by number of votes, than, say, a Czech and Polish situation, or just to give, just the intellectual point I'm asking. Thank you.
So, maybe Adam or Maria didn't say anything?
Yes, I wanted to come back to a couple of points, but just a brief reply to I don't think that the Visegrad cooperation prevents any of its members from joining voting clubs on issue that is relevant for the country. It's, as I mentioned in the very beginning, Visegrad Group is a project-based grouping. And while the gentlemen were discussing, I had a look at the initial declaration of the Visegrad Group that was written almost 30 years ago. Referring to what was said by my Polish compatriots, the grouping does not have any ideological goal it wants to fulfill. The original declaration, and I think this is reiterated in every single declaration that the group has written so far and signed so far, there are always the same points. Support rule of law, support democracy, support cooperation between local governments, support transportation connections, and this refers also to the comment you meant, support energy cooperation, and this hasn't been, this is an infinite goal. You can always do something more. So in as much, I don't know whether your question about the goal of the group was more about how it should behave towards the other actors, but for me the group was always more about itself and cooperating within itself, fixing what was done bad during the post-communist times.
So just a few words. I think that the topics of the Russia could be one inspiring moment for the V4, not in the sense that it could be another defensive policy, But in the sense that the starting narrative of before in the 90s, if I remember well, that was that we have this experience of the communist regime and so on and so on. So the common, not the interest but the value could be to insist to another necessity on those values as a rule of law, not to prefer, let's say, in the case of Russia and Ukraine, the so-called real politics and so on. Yes, it could be something which really all those four countries have together and should stick on this and promote it and insist on that, not on the, as I already said, on the defensive. We should be against Russia, but we should insist on our values. I think that it could be the positive message.
Okay, thank you. So I would add last question, because it's connected with it's just basically the opposite of it, like what's the policy towards Russia. So is there any reason for the V4 to have a special connection with the US, for instance? Like, if you remember, there are some attempts in the history, there were periods of history that Donald Trump was dividing Europe for New Europe and Old Europe. V4 was this like friendly, American-friendly New Europe. Now there are similar attempts, but it doesn't apply to whole V4, right? Like Poland is a good example in a way that it's really fulfilling this 2% criteria. You know, that Trump was in Warsaw having this speech, which wasn't much analyzed actually. And so there's, in this respect, Poles are good examples. Hungary is trying to be a very friendly relationship with Israel. I suspect it's mainly because it wants to have a special relationship with the US. And should there be any privileged, or should V4 countries try to have some privileged relationship with the United States? Very briefly, anyone who wants to comment on this?
Well, on that matter, I would say let's not overstate the purpose of the V4. First of all, we are the European Union, and secondly, we can form groups that are consisted of countries with similar interests in the context of the EU. Of course, there is a different question in the defense policy, but that said, one of the strong deficiencies in the EU is we do not have a strong common voice. And of course, if we were talking about topics like Ukraine or Syria in the context of migration and things happening around in our backyard, basically, we need a strong common voice in the international diplomacy to tackle them. And in regard of defense policies, let's look at the V4, let's look at the map. Let's say Czech Republic and Hungary bought Swedish fighter jets. Poland bought American fighter jets. Slovakia is still deciding. Yes, we have few probably working jets, but considering new ones. But let's say that we would cooperate on strong level in the V4. If we would buy, let's say, Swedish fighter jets or only American fighter jets, we could have saved a really lot of money on the spare part, on training, on cooperation of covering each other airspaces like Benelux countries are doing, and we are not able or willing to do that. So first of all, I would say that let's cooperate on the European level, because it's a common issue. Of course, we are part of the NATO, but very current challenge from the international politics is that US is no longer so much willing to foot the bill for our defenses. We are strong. We have in combining, we have strong armies and equipment, of course, but we are fragmented among 28 countries. So deeper cooperation, not only on the V4 level, but on the European level, would make the EU more credible and save us a lot of money.
Okay, thank you. I think we ran out of time, but there are many interesting questions, and so perhaps you can continue after you finish here in the space for a little while for those who want to discuss something. And I would like to thank all the panelists for participating tonight, and even if there's all of in such a nice weather, and all of you for coming to participate and listen to this, and see you hopefully most of you on our tomorrow's event, which is called Multiple Challenges for Europe. Okay, so thank you and see you soon.